and welcome. I'm back with more books, and as you know, this week we are talking about books on tea and stories on tea. I'm going to take it forward and going to go back into the past and talk about some history books about tea. And to talk about that, I've got two wonderful books with me, one of which is really, really old. It'll take you back in the time around 7th or 8th century. And the other one, it's fairly recent. It came out around 3-4 years ago. So I'll talk about both these books because these two books cover different periods of time. The first book, it talks about the ancient idea of tea, how it used to be in the ancient Chinese culture. And the other one is about the British Empire and how tea became a new fad in the 17th, 18th, or 19th centuries. And even today, the kind of tea that we consume, it's mostly the gift of the empire, how they spread it through the industrial production. So I'm going to talk about these two books. The first one is called Ching, or some also call it King, the classic of tea. It was written in the 8th century by the ancient Chinese writer. He was called Lu Yu. He was a great tea master, and he traveled around China and spent a lot of years, in fact decades, in researching tea and writing about it. And then as a result, we found this book, The Classic of Tea, as it is called in English. Remember, this was the time of Tang Dynasty, which is considered to be the high point in Chinese civilization, which is something the Chinese people, they look back to and feel really proud of their culture. So it was during this time a lot of philosophy, a lot of art was being created. And it was then, in that period, Lu Yu lived and he wrote about it. So let's talk about him. He was a kind of a monk. He spent a lot of years in the monastery, and especially high up in the mountains. And it was part of his lifestyle. What he would do, he would often go to the countryside. He would pick the herbs. He would analyze them. And in the similar manner, he would pick the tea leaves because tea was a kind of it was getting popular during that time. It wasn't really that popular, which it became after Lu Yu's work. But still, a lot of people, especially the monks and people who practiced medicine, they used to consume this drink of tea. So this fellow, Lu Yu, he would gather tea leaves and he would brew it for himself and also his fellows in the monastery. And over the period of time, he started collecting and documenting all the knowledge that was there at that time about tea. And that is how this book came to be. And what we learn from this book from his writings is that tea was quite a popular beverage by that time, by the 7th or 8th century in China. For example, there was another Chinese historian from the 3rd century. His name was Guo Pu. And in one of his writings, he talks about area, which was really the title of the book, and it was kind of the dictionary. He was collecting the ideas that were there present in those times, the different words and phrases that were popular. And there he talks about how they were using certain leaves in their soups. And but most of the historians today, they think that probably it was being used as a medicine, or it was some kind of other drink. It wasn't really exactly the same tea that we consume today. And similarly, in the 3rd century, another evidence that we find is in the writings of another poet called Zhang Zai, and What he says is he's very specific here. He uses the term cha, or as we say in India, chai, and he says he talks about preferring the fragrant cha over six beverages. So it was really considered quite elite in taste in those times. So clearly, the tea or chow, it was pretty much there in the Chinese culture. And even the tea plant, which is a native of southern China, it was known to the people from very early times. And a lot has been written about it, although it went by different names. Sometimes it was called Tao, Tse, Chung, Kha, or even Ming. But clearly it was much desired drink. And in fact, a lot of poets and writers, they kind of romanticized it. They sometimes exaggerated its benefits to great lengths. Some of them wrote that it was helping them in relieving fatigue. Some said it was good for soul. Some said it was strengthening their will. Some said it was good for health benefits, for your body, for eyesight, for pain. All kind of things they talk about it. And we don't exactly know how much truth is in there, but certainly they believed it. So yes, the tea or chai or cha, it was there in the Chinese culture. But what happened was in the Tang dynasty, after Lu Yu's work, it became a preferred beverage in pretty much every household. And that's how it got popularized in the Chinese culture, and from there it became popular in the Japanese culture also. And subsequently, we see all the travelers that visited China over the next few centuries, for example, Marco Polo or others, they kept talking about this divine drink of chai, of tea, how these Chinese people were carrying this exotic drink and they were deriving a lot of health benefits from this particular drink. And that's how the West got the idea of it. They heard about it, and then they went on to explore it. And there we get to the next book, which is called The Empire of Tea. So now let's talk about this book and what it tells about the journey of tea from the Eastern culture to the Western culture. And the author tell us, there are three authors of the book, and they tell us that tea, it reached the Europeans via whispers, because in those times you didn't have this kind of popular media, of course. So what happened was, as more and more travelers, they kept visiting the Asian countries, they kept noticing this strange drink that people were talking about. A lot of travelers from the Arab world, from the European world, they were mentioning this particular drink, and nobody knew what this drink was called. So in different accounts we find this mention. So for example, this 16th century Italian scholar called Giovanni Ramusio, he mentions in his travel accounts, he mentions a conversation with an traveler from probably from Persia, I think. This traveler, his name was Haji Muhammad, and this traveler, or who was doing the trading work there, he talked about a mysterious plant, rather its leaves, which he said that they were putting in warm water, and there were, a lot of interesting things were happening. So he said that this was a kind of a mysterious herb, and when it was put in water, you felt that freshness in the aroma, and when you drink it, you kind of feel like you're recovering from all kind of ailments, whether it's in your mind or your body. And he said that people call it chai katai, and they're really not sharing it with everybody, but they're keeping it for very special people. and it's kind of a magical drink. That's how he described it. And of course, these kind of gossips and these kind of conversations were going to become more and more frequent with time, which is what happened over the next few decades. And as you would expect, the secret no longer remained a secret. Especially when you consider that these travelers, they were also writing about their experiences. So here are a couple of examples of what the travelers wrote about tea. So there is this Portuguese Dominican traveler called Gaspar de Cruz. He was traveling in China in the 16th century, and he wrote that whatsoever person or persons come to any man's house, they have a custom to offer him in a fine basket one porcelain cup with a kind of drink they call cha, which is somewhat bitter in taste and red in color, but it has medicinal values. And similarly, another Italian priest who was traveling there in 16th and 17th centuries, he wrote that here in China, they gather its leaves in the springtime and place them in a shady place to dry, and from the dried leaves, they brew a drink which they use at meals, which is served to friends when they come to visit. On such occasions, it is served continually as long as they remain engaged in conversations. And then there was another Dutch merchant who said, after their meat, the Chinese people, they use a certain drink, which is a pot with hot water made with powder of a certain herb called cha, which is much esteemed here and is well accounted of among them. So clearly, these writers, these travelers, they were doing the task of marketing, or rather popularizing this drink. And interestingly, the same thing was going on in Japan, where travelers were going and finding out more about this drink. In fact, it was not from China, but from Japan that this first shipment of tea was procured and transported back to Europe. And this was done with the help of Holland and Japan, their governments, and of course the Dutch merchant that I just mentioned. He was instrumental in getting that deal through. And the first shipment, it was sent in 1609, but the preparation of it was going on for several years. Because that's what a lot of these colonial enterprises were doing at that time. They were looking for new and exciting business opportunities. And as a matter of fact, there was there was British East India Company, then there was Dutch East India Company. This Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602, and one of its earliest and most important priorities was to establish a factory of tea in Japan, which is exactly what they did. And 7 years later, they were able to send a cargo of tea back to Europe. And once this happened, once it reached to the popular masses, or especially the elite class among the Europeans, it was only a matter of time before the tea was going to attract everyone's attention, and it was going to become more popular. And as you would expect from let's say an Oriental thing, or an object or thing from a foreign country, it was mostly the elites, the merchants, or certain ruling classes that were consuming it at first. And because the supply was not that much, very few people were able to grab hold of it. But as soon as they started trying it, and the news spread in their classes, people got obsessed with it, especially in the Britain, where it became kind of defining symbol of British identity. And it was kind of strange because in those times, none of that tea was growing or getting processed in Britain. All of it came from China or Japan. But once they become accustomed to it, they become obsessed with it. The Britain's priority changed, and they thought about planting the tea plants and starting their own factories in the British Empire. And this is what they did in different colonies of theirs, and particularly in India. In India, you'll find even today the same plantations that British started, they're still present. And by the 18th and the 19th century, what British were doing is they were growing it in their colonies and they were processing it here, and then they were shipping it back to the Britain. And so it had become, by that time, an important part of their identity. But the more important contribution of theirs was because now they were producing it commercially. It was becoming available in different parts of Britain and all over the world. And through these British colonies, the people who lived under the British Empire, let's say in countries like India, they started consuming this new drink, and it became really, really popular. In fact, so popular that even today and in the years after this production started, tea became the second most popular drink in the world after water. Yes, you heard it right. After water, the second most popular drink is tea. That's how popular this drink is. And for that, you have to give credit to the British Empire, although they did horrible things, but definitely they did certain good things too. And tea was definitely one of the good part of the empire. Another important thing that you have to keep in mind is the tea that the Chinese people were consuming or the Japanese people were consuming. It was not the same tea that got transported to Britain or Europe, or it wasn't prepared in the same manner that these Far East Asian countries were doing. So the British tea was slightly different from the Chinese or the Japanese tea, and consequently, when tea came to India and Indians started consuming it, it was quite different from the British tea. So from the China, it went to Britain, and then it came to India. You'll find the variations, and similarly when you go to Africa or the Middle Eastern countries, wherever the tea went, obviously, as it would happen with any food or drink recipe, it would evolve according to the local tastes. And so it happened in India. You got the modern chai, which was a combination of different spices that you have in India. And Indians also like to add sugar in it. And that's the kind of tea Indians started preferring, which you call chai. And you add milk in it, you add maybe cardamoms, maybe ginger, or maybe simply the masala that you get in any kind of shop. You walk into a grocery store and all you have to ask for is chai masala, and then you can add it in your tea, and that's how a lot of Indians like to have it. So there are, as I said, different variations of tea. There was this more like the green tea the Chinese were consuming, and then we got to the black tea, which was pretty much popular in the British culture. Sometimes they liked it with milk, sometimes they didn't. And when it came to India, it definitely had to be with milk, with a lot of spices, just like everything else we do here in India. So that's the story of how tea reached us from the ancient Asian cultures to Europe, and from Europe to its colonies, where people adopted it in their own ways. And that's how we found our chai or tea. So I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe. And don't forget to enjoy your chai or tea. Thank you.